The United States has announced its intention to impose additional tariffs ranging from 25% to 50% on steel and aluminum imports. The move was presented as a way to protect American industry, but Canada's response has shaken the foundations of North American trade. In a swift and unprecedented countermeasure, Canada struck back with its own tariffs and restrictions, effectively cutting off America from 23% of its total steel imports and nearly 60% of its aluminum supply. The scale of this retaliation has been described as one of the most devastating economic counterpunches in the history of US-Canada relations. Last year alone, Canada shipped over $24 billion worth of steel and aluminum to the United States. With that pipeline now disrupted, American manufacturers are scrambling to secure alternative supplies. What makes this particularly damaging is that Canada targeted the very industries Washington had hoped to protect. Instead of safeguarding American jobs, the tariffs have triggered a supply crisis that threatens to reduce US GDP by as much as 8%, placing more than $330 billion worth of exports at risk. For decades, US manufacturers relied heavily on Canadian steel and aluminum. Factories were designed around these materials, and supply chains became deeply integrated. When Canada closed the tap, companies across the United States were left reeling, facing soaring costs, cancelled contracts, and production delays. Roughly 90% of Canadian steel and aluminum exports traditionally flowed south to the US, a dependency that American officials underestimated until it was too late. The escalation can be traced back to what appeared at first to be a minor issue: Ontario's new tax on electricity exports to 3 US states. While relatively small in scale, Washington interpreted the measure as an act of unfairness. The Trump administration responded with threats of heavy tariffs on Canadian goods, including a 25% levy on steel and aluminum and additional taxes across the board. Canada, rather than back down, responded with precision. It imposed quotas and surcharges on American imports while curbing shipments of steel and aluminum to the US. The result was chaos in American industries that had long depended on these materials. Contracts fell apart, supply chains collapsed, and businesses faced impossible choices: pay soaring prices for lower quality substitutes or delay production indefinitely. In Canada, the economic damage was significant but more contained. Steel and aluminum account for only about 0.5% of national GDP, but their concentration in politically important regions such as Quebec and Ontario gave leaders little room to compromise. Ontario Premier Doug Ford pressed for aggressive retaliation, while Prime Minister Mark Carney pursued a more strategic approach, calculating that Canada could inflict disproportionate damage on US industries and political strongholds. Exports to the United States make up between 7% and 34% of provincial GDP across Canada, with provinces like Alberta, New Brunswick, and Saskatchewan most vulnerable to American trade disruptions. This level of integration meant that any conflict would inevitably hurt both sides. Yet Canada's focused strategy, targeting specific American sectors rather than applying broad tariffs, created maximum disruption with minimal self-inflicted damage. For President Trump, the political fallout has been severe. The tariffs were intended to demonstrate strength and protect American workers. Instead, they exposed vulnerabilities in US manufacturing. Companies in swing states began voicing their frustration publicly, warning that the tariffs were driving up costs, destroying long-standing partnerships, and undermining their competitiveness. On the ground, the human cost quickly became apparent. Workers faced layoffs as factories slowed or shut down. Consumers felt the impact through higher prices on everyday goods. Supply chains that had operated smoothly for decades suddenly fractured, leaving industries from automobiles to technology scrambling for alternatives. The timing could not have been worse. American manufacturing was already under strain from global supply chain disruptions, labor shortages, and rising costs. Canada's retaliation hit when the sector was most vulnerable, compounding existing challenges and creating a perfect storm of economic pressure. While overall trade between the two countries continued in other areas, the targeted sectors were left in turmoil. Canada's exports to the US even showed modest growth in early 2025 compared to late 2024, masking the severe pain in steel and aluminum. The conflict revealed how deeply interdependent North American economies have become under agreements like NAFTA and its successor, the USMCA. Canadian steel and aluminum were not simply competitors to US products, they were integral components of American manufacturing. Decades of integration cannot be undone overnight, and efforts to replace Canadian inputs with domestic or alternative sources have proven costly and disruptive. The lesson emerging from this crisis is clear. In a globalized economy, trade wars rarely create winners. Instead of strengthening domestic industries, the tariffs have weakened them by disrupting the very supply chains that kept them competitive. What was intended as a show of power has turned into a spiral of retaliation, leaving businesses and workers on both sides of the border to bear the cost. The scars from this conflict may last for years. Trust has been damaged, and long-standing economic ties have been frayed. The question now is whether the two countries can repair their relationship and restore stability, or whether this trade war marks the beginning of a more fractured era in North American commerce. This is True Estate Report. Thanks for watching. We'll see you in the next video.